The council chamber of the Dominion Conclave was not designed to make anyone comfortable. That was, in fact, the entire point of it. It sat at the geometric heart of the Conclave's administrative flagship, the Eternal Mandate, a vessel so large that lesser civilizations had occasionally mistaken it for a space station, a mistake the Conclave's protocol officers quietly encouraged. The chamber itself was a vast vaulted oval, its ceiling lost somewhere in engineered shadow, its walls lined with the carved seals of every species the Conclave had absorbed in 300 years of patient, methodical expansion. 114 seals. 114 civilizations that had looked up one day to find the Conclave already there, already waiting, already holding documents that made the outcome feel inevitable. The floor was polished black stone quarried from the dead moon of Kethvara, the Conclave's founding world, and it reflected everything: the blue-white light of the holographic systems, the dim glow of the atmospheric processors, the faces of the 7 council members seated around the great obsidian table at the chamber's center. It reflected them perfectly, flawlessly, so that each counselor sat above their own mirror image staring upward from the depths of the floor. The architects had intended this. Power, the Conclave's founders had believed, should always be able to see itself. Ambassador Vreth Kalon of the Diplomatic Directorate had spent 31 years in this chamber. He knew every shadow of it, every echo, every subtle trick of acoustics that made a whisper carry to the far wall and a silence feel like a held breath. He was old by Veth standards. His 6-fingered hands showed the pale, faintly luminescent veining that came with age, and the ridge of cartilage that ran from his brow to the crown of his skull had deepened from silver to near white. But his eyes were still sharp, still hungry in the particular way that distinguished a diplomat from a bureaucrat. Bureaucrats wanted order, diplomats wanted leverage. He pressed 4 of his 6 fingers together now, a habit so old it had become unconscious, and let the silence of the chamber work on the room before he spoke. Silence, he had long ago learned, was the most efficient tool in any negotiation. It made lesser beings fill the void with their own anxieties. It created a pressure that no spoken word could manufacture. It was free, it was inexhaustible, and in 31 years he had never once found a species immune to it. The holographic dossier rotated above the table, a slow, pale blue constellation of data points, charts, system maps, and surveillance imagery. At its center, rendered in careful topographic detail, was a star system unremarkable in almost every measurable respect. 1 yellow dwarf, 8 planets, one of them hospitable, 2 small moons, a thin asteroid belt between the 4th and 5th orbital positions. And on the 3rd planet, clustered most densely on the landmasses of the northern hemisphere, the thermal signatures and electromagnetic outputs of approximately 9 billion living creatures going about their brief, busy, oblivious lives. Humans. Humans, Vreth Kalon said at last, and let the word occupy the chamber alone for just a moment before he continued. He said it the way a collector might name an unremarkable piece, not dismissive exactly, but with the particular flatness of a man who has seen too many extraordinary things to be surprised by something ordinary. Class 3 civilization. Atmospheric flight achieved approximately 100 years ago by their calendar. Interstellar capability, and I use the term generously, for less than 40. He paused, allowing the data behind him to shift, the display adjusting to show vessel silhouettes. Their largest recorded spacecraft is a mid-range commercial freighter designated the Aurelius Bright, 12,000 tons give or take, civilian-grade drive system, cargo configuration. No armament beyond a token point defense array that our intelligence analysts describe, and I am quoting directly here, as optimistic in intent if not in capability. The laughter that moved through the chamber was quiet, restrained, as all things were restrained in the conclave's formal spaces, but it was real. 7 species, and all of them understood the shape of that particular joke. Across the table, Fleet Marshal Drunsotha of the Keth Expeditionary Command did not laugh. Drunsotha rarely laughed. He had the kind of face that seemed architecturally opposed to the concept, broad gray plates of natural armor running from his jaw to his collarbones, small dark eyes set deep beneath a brow ridge that gave him a permanent expression of geological skepticism. He had fought 14 campaigns in service to the Conclave. He had absorbed 6 civilizations personally, which in the language of the Directorate meant he had been present when the Herald vessels broadcast the terms, and he had been the one to authorize the response when those terms were declined. He was not cruel. He simply had no patience for inefficiency, and resistance in his long experience was almost always inefficient. He looked at the vessel silhouettes on the display and said nothing for a moment. His jaw slits, the secondary breathing apparatus that the Keth used in vacuum-adjacent environments, flexed once. 12,000 tons, he said. At their largest, Vreth Kalon confirmed. Our resupply tenders run 15,000 tons. Oh yes. Drunsotha was quiet for another moment. Then he leaned back in his chair, which was a significant event in terms of displaced mass, and exhaled through his jaw slits in a long, slow breath that everyone at the table recognized as his version of relaxation. Then I see no complication. Standard absorption protocol. Herald convoy first, 3 cruisers, diplomatic manifest, full ceremonial configuration. Give them the terms in their primary language, grant them the standard 72-hour consideration period, and await response. A pause. If they respond constructively, we proceed to integration. If they respond otherwise, he moved one massive clawed hand in a gesture so small and casual it was almost insulting. We remind them what a real fleet looks like. No one disagreed. Disagreeing with Drunsotha was technically possible. The conclave ran on consensus, at least in principle. But it required a specific kind of energy that none of the other 6 counselors felt the subject warranted. The human question had been tabled 3 times in the past decade, delayed by other priorities. The Marin insurgency, the trade dispute with the Pellucid Compact, the long and tedious business of renegotiating the inner corridor transit fees. Humanity had been a footnote, then a pending item, then finally a formal agenda point. And now, seated around the black table with the dossier turning above them, it felt less like a decision and more like a formality. Something to be signed, stamped, and filed. The data behind Vrethkalan's conclusions was, by any reasonable measure, exhaustive. The Conclave's intelligence apparatus, formally the Directorate of Civilizational Assessment, informally and somewhat affectionately known among its own staff as the Quiet Eye, had been observing humanity for 11 years. 11 years of passive surveillance, conducted from observation platforms disguised as drifting debris in the outer reaches of the human solar system, and from relay drones embedded in the asteroid belt at distances that rendered them invisible to human sensor technology. 11 years of accumulated data. Electromagnetic emissions, energy output curves, population distribution models, technological development trajectories, economic activity patterns, cultural transmission indices. It was, the Quiet Eye's senior analyst Proctor Veshaman had noted in her executive summary, one of the most thoroughly documented pre-absorption subjects in the Directorate's history. The sheer volume of human electromagnetic output made observation almost embarrassingly easy. Humans broadcast constantly. Entertainment programming, navigational signals, commercial communications, personal transmissions, academic data exchanges, governmental announcements, and a frankly bewildering variety of audio content that the Directorate's cultural analysts had spent 3 years attempting to categorize before eventually labeling the entire category recreational acoustic expression and moving on. Veshaman was a meticulous analyst. 40 years in the Directorate, 12 absorption assessments. A reputation for comprehensive work and conservative conclusions, she was not, her colleagues said, a woman who missed things. The assessment she had delivered to the Council was 512 pages long. It covered human biology, human psychology, human political structures, human economic frameworks, human technological capability, human historical patterns of conflict, and human spacefaring capacity in exhaustive, cross-referenced, footnoted detail. It was a masterwork of intelligence analysis. It was thorough and careful and internally consistent. It was also, though no one in the chamber yet knew this, catastrophically incomplete in exactly one area, the area that, as it happened, mattered most. But that revelation was still 17 days away. For now, the dossier turned above the table, and the council members read from it the story it told, and the story was a comfortable one. Subcommander Isentar had read the same dossier 4 times on the transit from the Conclave's central hub to the staging point near the Kepler corridor. She was thorough by temperament, a quality that had served her well through a career that had taken her from junior navigation officer to her current position overseeing diplomatic convoy operations, a role that sat at the precise intersection of military authority and political theater. She had conducted 11 first contact operations under the absorption protocol. She knew the sequence the way a musician knows a well-practiced piece, not just the notes but the feeling of each transition, the places where the rhythm shifted, the moments that required particular delicacy and the moments that simply required patience. She read the human dossier with the professional attention she gave all her subjects. She noted the technological limitations. She noted the absence of any coherent military doctrine beyond their own system's defense perimeter. She noted the cultural fragmentation. Humanity was not, by any conventional measure, a unified civilization. They maintained dozens of separate governmental structures, hundreds of distinct cultural identities, and had spent the better part of their recorded history in various states of conflict with themselves. The Conclave had absorbed species like this before. The process was usually straightforward. The absorption terms offered something they couldn't achieve internally: stability, resources, protected trade lanes, the vast machinery of an interstellar civilization into which their own modest output could plug and become for the first time genuinely meaningful. Most species offered that said yes, not because they were cowardly, because they were practical. The few that said no were, in Isentar's experience, the ones who hadn't yet fully grasped the differential. The ones who looked at 3 Conclave cruisers and thought, we've handled worse. They hadn't, of course. But it took a demonstration to make that clear, and demonstrations, while effective, were inefficient. Inefficiency was, in the Conclave's operational vocabulary, the closest thing to a moral failing. She hoped the humans would be practical. The dossier, on balance, suggested they would be. Pragmatic cultures tended toward accommodation when the power differential was unambiguous, and there was nothing ambiguous about 3 cruisers appearing in your system and asking politely. The cultural analysis section of Veshamun's report had flagged certain elements of human behavioral history that might complicate initial reception. A strong documented instinct toward territorial defense, an apparently irrational resistance to perceived coercion even when resistance was materially futile. But the same section had concluded with careful confidence that these tendencies were historically mitigated when the opposing force was sufficiently superior to make resistance feel genuinely pointless. 12,000 tons, the report said, no warships. Isentar had closed the dossier on the 3rd reading feeling something close to sympathy. Humanity had reached the stars and done something remarkable with that achievement. They had built stations and mapped lanes and pushed their clumsy ships out into the dark with what the cultural analysts described as disproportionate optimism given their demonstrated capability. There was something almost admirable about it. They were small and they knew they were small and they went anyway. They just hadn't yet learned what waited out here. She was, she supposed, part of what waited. The Aurelius Bright was the kind of ship that people in the shipping trade called a workhorse, and people outside the shipping trade called unremarkable. She ran a regular circuit between humanity's outer colony stations and the mineral processing platforms near the asteroid belt, a route so routine that her crew of 14 had long since stopped noticing the view. Space, when you lived in it, became less like a wonder and more like a commute. Her captain was a heavyset woman named Dorota Malik who had been flying cargo for 23 years and whose primary recreational interest was competitive card games, which she pursued with the same methodical patience she applied to everything else. She was not, by any reasonable assessment, a dramatic person. So when the Aurelius Bright's long-range array flagged 3 large contacts emerging from fold space approximately 40 million kilometers somewhat of her current position, Dorota Malik did not react dramatically. She looked at the contacts for a long moment. She looked at their drive signatures, which did not match any human vessel on record. She looked at their approach vector, which was direct and unhurried in the particular way that very large things with no reason to hurry tend to move. She looked at the transponder signals they were broadcasting, which were on a frequency her system recognized as the Conclave Diplomatic Hailing Band, a band that the Conclave had apparently assumed, not unreasonably, that humanity would be monitoring. She was not monitoring it, but her ship's automated systems had flagged it because the system's automated systems flagged everything, which was how she preferred things. Dorota set down her coffee. She opened a channel to the nearest relay station. She transmitted in the calm and slightly bored tone of a woman reporting a minor anomaly on a maintenance log. Relay 7, this is Aurelius Bright at grid position Delta 9. I've got 3 unidentified large contacts on approach, broadcasting what my system is identifying as a conclave diplomatic frequency. Thought someone should know. Then she picked her coffee back up and watched the contacts on her display and thought about her next card game. Relay 7 passed the message to the Inter-System Communication Hub. The hub passed it to the United Earth Treaty Organization's Monitoring Division. The Monitoring Division passed it to the Standing Coordination Committee, which had been in continuous low-level session for 9 years in preparation for exactly this kind of contact, and which had 9 years ago established a protocol that now activated with the quiet efficiency of a mechanism that has been carefully maintained and is finally being used for its intended purpose. The protocol had a name, though it was never used in public documentation. Internally, in the secure servers of the committee's administrative staff, it was labeled simply Threshold. Threshold did a number of things in rapid sequence. It transmitted a series of coded signals on 11 different frequencies simultaneously. It updated the operational status of 17 vessels currently on standby in 3 separate locations. It transmitted authentication codes to 12 individuals currently going about their ordinary lives, in positions ranging from ship captains to station commanders to the quiet, unranked coordinators who had spent 9 years maintaining systems they hoped would never need to be used and had always known would. And it opened a channel to the UES Perseverance, a ship that the Conclave's Directorate of Civilizational Assessment had catalogued as a mid-range science and survey vessel of no particular military significance. The Perseverance was technically a science and survey vessel. The science and survey equipment it carried was real and functional. The surveys it had conducted over its 9-year operational life were legitimate and had produced genuine academic value. It was also the designated diplomatic interface vessel for first contact under threshold, which meant that Captain Yara Okonkwo, who had been asleep for approximately 4 hours after a 20-hour data analysis shift, was awakened by her first officer and informed that the moment they had been quietly preparing for was now a present tense rather than a future one. She sat up, she ran her hands over her face. She said, "Time to contact." At their current approach velocity, approximately 90 minutes until they're within standard hailing range, they're already broadcasting on the diplomatic frequency. Are we translating? Already running, the signal is yes, we have it. It's a standard announcement of intent, identifies them as the Dominion Conclave, describes themselves as representatives of a multi-species governmental compact, requests acknowledgement of receipt. A brief pause. They're being very polite about it. Okonkwo stood. She was a tall woman with close-cropped hair that had gone silver at the temples sometime in the past 3 years, a development she had decided was dignified rather than alarming. She had a face that defaulted to calm, not because she was unfeeling, but because she had spent enough of her life in situations that rewarded steadiness over expressiveness, that steadiness had become her natural register. She was 54 years old. She had been captain of the Perseverance for 9 of those years, selected for the position with full knowledge of what the position might eventually require. She had prepared for this. Threshold had prepared for this. Humanity had prepared for this quietly and carefully and without fanfare for 9 years. She pulled on her uniform jacket. Transmit acknowledgement on their frequency, standard diplomatic receipt confirmation, tell them we've received their signal and we're preparing a response. She paused, and wake the coordination committee, all of them, they'll want to be in session when this develops. Her first officer moved to execute. Okonkwo walked to the viewport at the rear of her quarters, a small luxury she'd insisted on when the ship was outfitted, a single meter-wide transparency looking aft, and stood for a moment looking at the stars. Somewhere out there, 3 large ships were moving toward them with the unhurried confidence of an institution that had never been wrong before. She found herself wondering briefly what their faces looked like when something surprised them. The surveillance records that the Conclave's quiet eye had compiled over 11 years were stored in a secure archive that fewer than 200 individuals had authorization to access. Proctor Veshaman was one of them. She had built the archive more or less not alone, but as the primary organizing intelligence behind the Human Assessment Project, which had begun as a low-priority observation request from the Directorate's Expansion Planning Division, and had grown over time into the most comprehensive single-subject file the Quiet Eye had ever assembled. She was proud of it in the particular way that analysts are proud of things, not loudly, not publicly, but with a deep and quiet satisfaction in its completeness. Every observation logged, every data point cross-referenced, every conclusion supported by multiple independent sources. She had been meticulous. What she had not been, though she would not know this for another 17 days, was omniscient. The observation platforms in the outer system had excellent coverage of the human solar system's ecliptic plane, the flat disk in which all 8 planets orbited and in which humanity had built its spacefaring infrastructure, its stations and platforms and routes and colonies. Everything Veshaman's team had observed had been on the ecliptic. Everything worth observing was on the ecliptic. That was what she had assumed. And she had been right insofar as the assumption went. The freighters were on the ecliptic. The colony ships were on the ecliptic. The cheerful, cluttered stations were on the ecliptic. The Aurelius Bright and 1,000 vessels like her were on the ecliptic, and they had all been observed and catalogued and assessed and found consistent with a Class 3 civilization in the early stages of interstellar development. What Veshaman had not known, what her observation platforms had not been positioned to see, because they had been positioned to observe the ecliptic and not the vast, quiet, gravitationally complex space below it, was what humanity had been doing in the shadow of their largest gas giant for 31 years. The gas giant in question was the 5th planet of the human system, a vast striped sphere that humanity called by the name of one of their ancient mythological figures. It was the largest planet in the system by a considerable margin and occupied a stable gravitational position that, for a certain class of large-scale construction project, offered useful properties. It was also, as the Quiet Eye's observation platforms had been oriented, almost perfectly placed to mask the thermal and electromagnetic signatures of construction activity occurring in the gravitational null pocket, directly opposite its major axis. Almost perfectly. Not quite perfectly, it turned out there had been detectable anomalies, faint ones, in 3 years' worth of background radiation data from that region of the system. Veshamon's automated analysis systems had flagged them. They had been categorized after review as natural variants, geological activity in the outer system, expected variation in solar-wind interaction with the gas giant's magnetosphere. They had been wrong, but the wrongness was subtle enough that finding it required something Veshamon's analysis system had not thought to do: look for something that wasn't supposed to be there. In the null pocket, in the long quiet space below the plane of the ecliptic, behind the convenient bulk of humanity's largest planet, 31 years of concentrated human engineering had produced something that would have rewritten the directorate's assessment from the first page to the last. But Veshamon was in her office on the Eternal Mandate, reviewing her completed file with the satisfaction of a job well done, and the null pocket was 47 light-minutes away, and what was in it was still, for the moment, the best-kept secret in the human solar system. In the archive of the Conclave's Cultural Studies Division, a department that most people in the Directorate considered academic rather than operationally relevant, there was a report on human history that had been read, in its entirety, by exactly 3 people. It had been commissioned as supplementary material for Veshamon's assessment, a contextual backdrop to the more practically focused surveillance data, and it had been produced by a cultural analyst named Dunveth Karash, whose specialty was what the Conclave's academic community called civilizational behavioral patterns, the deep tendencies that recurred across a species' history regardless of political structure or technological development level. Karash's report on humanity was, by the standards of cultural analysis, alarming, not because humans were violent. Many civilizations were violent in their early phases, and violence, the Conclave had found, tended to diminish as the practical benefits of cooperation became more obvious. Not because they were irrational. Humans were, in Karash's assessment, actually quite rational when they chose to be, which was a more nuanced observation than it appeared. Not because they were aggressive. Because they were patient. Not universally. Not always. But as a documented civilizational characteristic, appearing in case after case across their recorded history, in contexts ranging from military strategy to political maneuvering to economic competition to engineering projects of impractical scale. Humans, when they believed something important was at stake, were capable of a quality of long-term patient planning that Karash found unusual enough to flag explicitly. He had documented it in detail. He cited the construction of their largest ancient monuments, projects spanning generations, executed with consistent intent across timescales that most species' political structures couldn't maintain. He cited their military history, the cases, recurring and notable, where human strategists had deliberately presented a weaker appearance than their actual capability to draw an opponent into a position of false confidence. He cited their economic history, the long patience of certain human institutions in building toward outcomes measured in decades rather than quarters. He had titled this section of his report The Concealment Instinct, and he had noted, with what in retrospect was remarkable prescience, it would be a significant error to assume that because a human civilization is showing you something, what you are seeing represents the complete picture. Human strategic thinking has a strong and documented historical preference for revealing capability at the moment of maximum effect rather than allowing it to be observed in advance. This is not deceptive in the conventional sense. It is simply a different temporal relationship to disclosure. Where most species display strength continuously as a deterrent, humans appear to calculate that selective concealment followed by timely revelation can produce superior strategic outcomes. The report had been filed. It had been read by 3 people. It had been categorized as supplementary background material. It had not made it into Veshamon's executive summary. Karash had flagged this omission in an internal memo. The memo had been received, acknowledged, and filed. The Eternal Mandate was a very large ship with very many files. In the Conclave Council chamber, as the meeting drew toward its conclusion, Fleet Marshal Drunsatha stood, a process that involved considerable deliberate motion, the Keth having evolved a musculature optimized for the high gravity of their homeworld, and addressed the chamber one final time. The Kepler corridor, he said, is strategically significant. It represents the cleanest transit route between our 4th and 5th expansion zones, and human territory sits directly across it. This is not negotiable in terms of outcome. The question has always been cost, and the assessment, he nodded toward the dossier still rotating softly above the table. The assessment makes clear that the cost in this case will be minimal, 12,000 tons, no warships. A fractured political structure that has never in its history successfully unified against an external threat. He looked around the table. His dark eyes moved from face to face with the slow, complete attention of a man who had spent a lifetime reading rooms. "We are not cruel," he said, and he meant it in his way. "We offer them what we have offered 114 civilizations before them, a place at the table, resources, protection, the end of their isolation." A pause. Some of them understood the gift immediately, others required more time. In either case, the outcome was the same. He straightened fully, which brought him to a height that made 3 of the 7 counselors adjust their seating slightly, unconsciously, in the way that bodies respond to scale before minds catch up. "Proceed with the convoy. Standard protocol. This time next season, humanity will be the 115th seal on that wall." He turned and looked at the wall in question, the long curving arc of carved emblems, each one representing a civilization that had been and was now something else, something folded into the greater whole of the conclave's dominion. He looked at the empty space at the end of the row, the space that had been left for the next one. He was already thinking about the one after that. Somewhere in the administrative records of the United Earth Treaty Organization Standing Coordination Committee, in a folder labeled with a string of alphanumeric characters that looked like a filing error but was actually a deliberate obfuscation, there was a document that had been updated quarterly for 9 years. It tracked a single metric, the estimated readiness date for Threshold's second phase. For 9 years, that date had been marked pending. 2 years ago, it had changed. It now read readies. Nobody outside the coordination committee knew this. That was the point. The committee had spent 9 years not knowing, or rather not being able to confirm whether the conclave was watching. The anomalous drones detected in the outer system in the early years of Threshold's planning phase had been cautiously assumed to be conclave observation assets, which meant everything humanity did in visible space was potentially observed. The committee had proceeded on that assumption with methodical care. The freighters flew their routes. The colony ships moved their people. The stations broadcast their music into the dark. Everything that could be seen was exactly what it appeared to be. And below the ecliptic, in the long quiet shadow of a gas giant named for an old god, the work continued. The Thermopylae had been the last to be completed. Her commissioning ceremony had been attended by 43 individuals representing the nations of the Architects' Compact, held in a pressurized bay on the construction platform with no cameras, no broadcast, no record beyond the handwritten notes that Committee Chair Elena Vasquez had kept in a physical journal that had never been digitized. There had been no speeches. There had been food, and there had been what Vasquez later described in her journal as the particular silence of people who have finished something they are not sure they will ever need to use, and are very glad it exists anyway. The Thermopylae displaced just under 30,000 tons. Her 16 sister ships ranged from 18 to 26,000 tons each. They had drives that bore no resemblance to anything in humanity's public technological record. The public record showed full drive technology at Generation 2, adequate for the colony routes, efficient enough for commercial purposes. The drives on the Threshold fleet were Generation 4, the product of a parallel development program that had been running since before Threshold itself had a name. They had weapon systems, real ones, not the optimistic point-defense arrays of the Aurelius Bright. The weapon systems had been tested extensively in the Null Pocket and at a secondary range facility in the outer Kuiper Belt, in conditions of what the test records described as rigorous functional evaluation and what the people who had conducted the tests described in private as genuinely impressive. They had 17 crews drawn from the naval and aerospace traditions of 43 nations, trained together in the Null Pocket for 3 years in doctrine, tactics, and the particular skills required to operate a vessel that no one outside Threshold knew existed. The crews were good. The commanders were exceptional. Captain Okonkwo of the Perseverance was not the senior officer of the Threshold fleet. That honor belonged to Admiral Reyes Marchetti of the Thermopylae. But she was the diplomatic interface, chosen because she had the precise combination of steadiness, intelligence, and what the selection committee had called conversational authority that the role required. None of this was in Veshamon's dossier. None of this was on the ecliptic. The council meeting concluded in 47 minutes. It was, Vrethkalon reflected as he gathered his materials, one of the shorter sessions in recent memory. Humanity had turned out to be a simple agenda item after all. A thing to be organized, not debated. The convoy would depart in 11 days, reach the Kepler corridor in 6, make contact, present terms, and await response. He paused at the door of the chamber and looked back at the dossier display, which was still rotating above the empty table, cycling now through the image archive of photographs of human cities, human stations, human ships. The Aurelius Bright appeared in one frame, moving sedately against the backdrop of the asteroid belt, her running lights blinking in patient sequence. 12,000 tons, no warships, a fractured civilization that had never unified against an external threat. Everything the data said. He turned off the display, The hologram died, and the chamber returned to darkness and reflection, the polished floor giving back the dim light of the atmospheric processors, the carved seals on the wall standing in their rows of quiet permanence. 114. He walked out into the corridor, already thinking about the next item on his schedule. Behind him, the empty space at the end of the row of seals waited, patient as carved stone, patient as certainty, for a name that had not yet been decided, a future that had not yet been written, for the small, clumsy, music broadcasting, fireworks celebrating, mid-range freighter-flying people who looked up at the same stars and had for 9 years been looking right back. Dunveth Karash's unread words sat in their archive folder. Humans calculate that selective concealment followed by timely revelation can produce superior strategic outcomes. 17 days away, in the shadow of a gas giant named for an old god, 17 ships that weren't supposed to exist waited in the dark with the particular patience of something that has been waiting a very long time and knows, with quiet certainty, that the waiting is almost over. The conclave closed the file. Humanity had barely opened theirs. The Kepler corridor was not, strictly speaking, a place. It had no atmosphere, no surface, no coordinates that pointed to anything solid. It was a designation, a navigational concept, a named stretch of interstellar space that happened to sit at the intersection of 3 hyperlane routes and 1 fold space transit shortcut that the Conclave's cartographic division had identified some 40 years ago as strategically significant. Space was full of such designations. The Conclave had named thousands of them, the way an empire names roads and passes and river crossings. Not because the places were remarkable in themselves, but because they were where things passed through, and control of where things passed through was, in the final analysis, what an empire actually controlled. The corridor was approximately 12 light towers across at its narrowest navigable point. It sat in the outer reaches of what humanity called their treaty space, a term the Conclave's legal division had noted in the assessment files with the particular kind of careful neutrality that legal divisions use when they want to record something without immediately addressing its implications. Treaty space. As though the designation of a boundary by one party constituted something binding on another. As though a name on a chart was a wall. The Conclave had encountered this phenomenon before. Young civilizations frequently drew lines on maps and believed in them with a conviction that was, in its way, admirable. The lines usually survived contact with the Conclave for approximately as long as it took to explain politely who was actually standing at the border. The diplomatic convoy translated out of fold space into the corridor on the 43rd day of the 11th month of the Conclave's administrative calendar, a date that meant nothing to humanity, who used a different system, but which the convoy's mission log would record with the precision that military operations demanded. 3 cruisers in standard formation, the resolute Patience at point, the extended Grace, and the Voice of Many Worlds flanking at 30,000-kilometer intervals. Behind them, the Herald vessel terms of inclusion, small and brilliantly lit, broadcasting the Conclave's diplomatic signals on every frequency their records indicated humanity monitored. And behind that, quiet and watchful, the destroyer Escort Necessary Clarity, whose name had always struck Isentar as unusually honest for a warship. The fold space translation was smooth. It always was with experienced crews. There was the familiar moment of profound wrongness that no amount of experience ever quite normalized, the sensation that the universe had briefly forgotten its own rules and then remembered them with a slight embarrassment. And then they were simply there in normal space in the corridor, with the stars around them and the distant warmth of humanity's yellow sun a bright point some 12 light towers ahead. Isentar stood at the primary command station of the Resolute Patience and ran through the post-translation checklist with her bridge crew in the efficient silence of a team that had done this often enough to make it automatic. Drive systems nominal, navigation reference acquired, weapons at standby not active not yet but ready the way a professional keeps a hand near a tool without reaching for it. Long-range sensors sweeping. Contact, said her sensor officer Liaison Grade Prethsalin, whose voice had the flat, precise quality of someone trained to report facts without editorializing. Single vessel, bearing 047, elevation +12, range approximately 41,000 kilometers, mass reading consistent with a brief pause. Consistent with a mid-range science and survey vessel, human configuration, broadcasting civilian transponder codes. Isentar looked at the tactical display. There it was, a small green indicator, sitting in the middle distance with the unconcerned stillness of something that had been waiting, which it had been, she supposed. Someone would have seen them translate in. The question was whether it was coincidence that a human vessel was already in the area or whether it was something else. She decided it didn't particularly matter. One mid-range science vessel, whatever it was doing here, it was not a threat. Open a channel on the diplomatic frequency, she said. Standard first contact protocol, formal identification, statement of intent, invitation to respond. The communications officer opened the channel. Isentar straightened slightly. There was always a moment, even after 11 of these, where the formality of it settled on her like a physical weight. 11 species she had spoken to for the first time. 11 conversations that had ended the same way, one way or another. She was good at them. She had a voice that carried authority without aggression. A skill she had spent years cultivating because the alternative, authority with aggression, produced responses that were emotionally satisfying and operationally expensive. She spoke the standard greeting in the conclave's diplomatic lingua, which her communications system simultaneously translated into the primary human language their records identified as most widely used. She identified herself, identified the convoy, identified the conclave, stated the purpose of their presence in terms that were accurate without being blunt, and expressed the conclave's interest in establishing formal communication with the appropriate human authorities. It was a good speech, measured, professional, not threatening but not soft. The kind of speech that said, "We are serious, we are here, and we would like to begin." What came back was not what she expected. Not because it was hostile. Not because it was confused or afraid or halting in the way that first responses often were when a civilization realized it was no longer alone in the way it had imagined. It came back in the steady, clear, entirely unbothered voice of a woman who sounded, more than anything else, like she had been expecting this call. Conclave Convoy, this is Captain Yara Okonkwo of the UES Perseverance. You are currently in United Earth Treaty space. Please transmit your intentions and credentials. You are being tracked. Isentar processed this for a moment. You are being tracked. She looked at Prethsalin. Prethsalin looked back at her with the expression of someone who has just been told something that contradicts their sensor data and is not yet sure which one to believe. I have one contact, he said quietly for her ears only. One, at 41,000 kilometers, nothing else in active sensor range. Isentar looked back at the display. The single green indicator sat placidly in the middle distance. She decided that the human captain was either bluffing, which would be bold, given the circumstances, and would suggest either tremendous courage or a profound misunderstanding of the situation, or was describing something that Prethsalin's sensors weren't seeing, which was a different kind of problem entirely. She opted for the response that covered both possibilities. She opened the channel again. Captain Okonkwo, this is Sub-Commander Isentar, commanding the Dominion Conclave Diplomatic Convoy. Our credentials and full diplomatic manifest are being transmitted on a secondary channel now. Regarding your statement of intent, she kept her voice level, pleasant, the voice of someone who is not yet choosing to be concerned. We come representing the Dominion Conclave, a multi-species governmental compact currently comprising 22 member worlds. We are here to open formal dialogue with the appropriate representatives of your species regarding the possibility of integrating your civilization into the Conclave's broader framework. This is a beneficial arrangement that Sub-Commander, the human captain's voice came back without pause, without the processing delay that nervousness or surprise produced, just immediate, present. I'm going to stop you there. Isentar stopped. Terms of integration isn't something we're in the market for today. A brief pause, and in that pause Isentar thought she detected something, not amusement exactly, but a close relative of it. I've notified my command. You'll want to hold your position as well. The phrasing landed oddly. You'll want to hold your position, not please hold your position, which was a request, not you are ordered to hold your position, which would have been absurd. You'll want to, as though holding position was something the convoy would choose to do once it understood why. As though the human captain knew something that Isentar did not and was, with complete equanimity, waiting for Isentar to catch up. The professional part of Isentar, the part that had conducted 11 of these and knew them as well as she knew her own reflection, noted this with a careful, quiet attention. First contacts produced all kinds of responses. Awe, fear, aggression, confusion, elaborate formality, awkward overeagerness. She had seen all of them. She had never, in 11 first contacts, encountered a response that felt quite this much like the other party, was already several moves into a game she hadn't realized was being played. She told herself it was performance, bravado, the human captain presenting a face she'd rehearsed, showing composure she didn't necessarily have. It was a reasonable interpretation. It was, in fact, the most probable interpretation. She opened the channel again. She let a shade more of her authority into her voice, not threatening but clarifying. The voice of someone establishing, gently but unmistakably, what the actual situation was. Captain Okonkwo, I want to be clear about what you are looking at. 3 conclave cruisers with combined displacement exceeding 90,000 tons. Armament sufficient to. Sub-Commander. She stopped again. Look behind you. In the history of Isentar's career, which spanned 31 years and included situations that had tested her equanimity in every way that situations can. She would later identify this as the moment she understood that something fundamental had gone wrong. Not wrong in the sense of danger, not immediately, but wrong in the sense of a calculation that had been running correctly for years suddenly producing an output that didn't match the model. She did not want to look behind her. That was the honest truth of it, the immediate instinctive response of a professional whose professional certainty was suddenly under pressure. Not looking was not an option. She was on a military vessel with a sensor officer whose job it was to tell her what was in space around her, and Preth Solin was already looking, already reading his display, and the color that was visibly draining from his face was telling her something before any word was spoken. She looked at the tactical display. The corridor behind her convoy was no longer empty. The transition had happened in seconds. Fold space exits were instantaneous in the sense that the process of emerging took no time once initiated, but the detection lag on long-range sensors meant that the contacts had been present for perhaps 15 seconds before her system had them plotted. 15 seconds. They had been sitting in normal space, in the space behind her convoy, for 15 seconds before she knew they existed. She counted them. Her mind did it automatically, the way trained minds do, not in sequence but all at once. The tactical processor that lived below conscious thought handing up the number before she'd finished looking. 17. 17 vessels deployed in a formation she didn't recognize. Not the flat plane formation of a standard fleet approach. Not the clustered defensive formation of a convoy under escort. Something else, a configuration that, as she studied it in the first stunned seconds, resolved itself slowly into a pattern that was simultaneously unfamiliar and in its underlying logic perfectly clear. They were positioned to cover every significant approach vector to the convoy's current location simultaneously. They were not surrounding her ships in the aggressive sense of the word. They were simply present, in every direction that mattered, already there. Preth Solin said in a voice that was doing its best. 17 contacts, various mass readings, the largest. He stopped. He looked at his display again. He looked at it the way a person looks at a number that cannot be right but evidently is. The largest contact is reading at approximately 29,000 tons, the smallest at another pause, 18,000 approximately, all readings preliminary subject to weapon signatures, Isentar said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that later. A longer pause. Preth Solin was running analysis at the speed his equipment allowed, which was very fast, and what the analysis was returning was fighting with his expectations in a way that slowed down his verbal output. Active power signatures consistent with, he stopped again. Sub-Commander, these are not in our database. She knew that. She had looked at the silhouettes now populating her tactical display, and she could see, with the immediate visual literacy of someone who had studied vessel configurations for 30 years, that not one of them matched anything the Conclave's assessment files had recorded for human spacefaring capability. They were long and dark and brutally angular in a way that spoke a language she recognized even without knowing the specific dialect, the language of vessels designed to fight. Not civilian ships made martial by circumstance. Not improvised deterrents bolted together from commercial components. Ships that had been designed from the keel up with a specific purpose in mind, and that purpose was what it was. The largest one had rotated. Not an aggressive maneuver, not a targeting adjustment. It had simply changed its aspect relative to her convoy, presenting its full profile rather than its bow, and the full profile was longer than she had expected, longer and more complex, with weapon emplacements that her sensor analysis was beginning to resolve from the background noise of its drive signature. The rotation was so unhurried it was almost contemplative, like a very large animal shifting its weight without particular urgency. She heard Drunsatha's voice in her memory with the clarity of a recording. Their largest vessel on record is a mid-range freighter, 12,000 tons, no warships of note. The Aurelius Bright, 12,000 tons. The vessel rotating on her tactical display, 29,000 tons. Civilian grade. No armament beyond a token point offense array described as optimistic in intent, if not in capability. She looked at the weapon emplacements resolving on her sensor sweep and felt something she rarely felt in a professional context. A sensation that started in her chest and moved outward, the particular cold bloom of understanding something she had not been prepared to understand. Captain Okonkwo, she said, and was surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. Those vessels are not in our records. The response came without delay, without particular emphasis, in the tone of someone confirming a minor factual point. No, they wouldn't be. The silence that followed that sentence occupied the bridge of the resolute patience like a physical presence. Isentar's crew were good people and trained professionals, and they were very, very quiet. She thought about the next move for 11 seconds. She counted them later when she reconstructed the conversation from memory and from the bridge recording that the mission log preserved in its unblinking entirety. 11 seconds of silence on an open channel, which in diplomatic terms was an eternity, and which she spent doing the calculation that the situation required. What did she know, what did she not know, and what was the correct action given the distance between those two things? What she knew, 17 human vessels, none of them matching any recorded configuration, surrounding her convoy in a formation that had been achieved before she knew they were there. Combined displacement significantly exceeding her convoys. Weapon signatures she couldn't fully characterize but could not reasonably interpret as defensive in nature. A human captain who had been waiting for this conversation and who was, by every behavioral indicator Isentar could read, exactly as calm as she appeared. What she did not know, how long the human vessels had been in fold space waiting for the translation signal. How they had achieved fold space capability beyond what the assessment records indicated. Whether the 17 contacts on her display were all of what was available or simply all of what had been deployed. Whether you are being tracked had referred to these ships or to something else she still wasn't seeing. The calculation was not a comfortable one. She opened the channel. Captain Okonkwo, Isentar paused, choosing words with the care of someone who has recognized that the situation requires a different kind of care than she had brought to it. It would be useful to have a direct conversation, not a broadcast, a closed channel between your vessel and mine. Another pause. I believe we have more to discuss than I initially understood. The response was 3 seconds, long enough to suggest the human captain was making her own calculation. Agreed, closed channel, subcommander, though I want to note for the record that my command has full logs of this conversation. As does mine, Isentar said, that's how it should be. The channel shifted. The background noise of the broadcast frequency dropped away and was replaced by the cleaner silence of a direct comlink. Just two ships in conversation with each other. The 17 contacts on Isentar's display holding their positions with the patient stillness of things that had been designed to wait. Captain, Isentar said, I would like to understand what I am looking at. That's a reasonable thing to want. Okonkwo's voice was the same as it had been from the first transmission, steady, unhurried, carrying a quality that Isentar gradually identified as not coldness, but rather the complete absence of performance. She was not trying to sound calm. She simply was calm in the way that preparation produces calm, the stillness that lives on the far side of having done everything one can do in advance. I'll tell you what I can tell you now, and we can talk about the rest in person if you're willing. I'm extending an invitation to come aboard the Perseverance for a formal conversation. You, a small staff, whatever makes you comfortable. No weapons. Albeit, we'll be unarmed as well. Isentar looked at her tactical display. Looked at 17 contacts that remained exactly where they were. Looked at the silhouette of the largest one, still presenting its profile, still unhurried, still simply there. She thought about what Drunsatha would say if she opened a channel to him now and described what her sensor display was showing. She thought about what Vrethkalan would say. She thought about the council chamber and the rotating dossier and the comfortable relief of a short meeting. She thought about the 114 seals on the wall of the chamber and the empty space at the end of the row. She thought about the human captain's voice, not what it said, the quality of it. The complete absence of the thing that Isentar had heard in every first contact she had ever conducted, that undertone of scale shock, the subtle register of a civilization suddenly confronted with how much larger the universe was than it had believed. Every species had it. It was not a weakness, it was simply the honest response to genuine surprise. Okonkwo didn't have it. She had sounded, from the first word of the first transmission, like someone receiving a call they had been expecting. I'll come aboard, Isentar said. The shuttle ride from the Resolute Patience to the Perseverance took 23 minutes. Isentar had brought 2 staff Prethsalin because she wanted her sensor officer's eyes on everything, and her diplomatic aide Chelenvas because Chelenvas had a memory that retained entire conversations verbatim and a face that gave nothing away. 3 people. Small enough to signal intent without appearing naive about it. She had spent the 23 minutes in the shuttle looking at the tactical feed from the Resolute Patience, watching the 17 contacts maintain their positions. They had not moved, had not adjusted formation, had not made any communication beyond the standard navigational transponder pings that vessels in proximity broadcast as a matter of protocol. They were simply there, holding their configuration with an equanimity that she found, in its way, more unsettling than aggression would have been. Aggression she knew how to read. This was something else, the stillness of things that have decided to wait because waiting is, for the moment, the correct choice, and that know the difference between patience and passivity. The Perseverance was, from the outside, exactly what the Conclave's assessment files said it was. Mid-range science and survey configuration, moderate displacement. The kind of ship that a civilization used to explore and study and document rather than to fight or carry freight. Its exterior showed the characteristic marks of active operational service, patched hull plating, sensor arrays in various generations of upgrade, the minor asymmetries that accumulated over years of maintenance in the field. Nothing about it suggested anything other than what it claimed to be. Isentar noted this. She noted it carefully. The Perseverance looked exactly right, which, in the context of 17 ships that had looked nothing like what they were supposed to look like, was itself a kind of information. The docking bay was clean and well-lit, staffed by 3 humans in what Isentar took to be their service uniform, dark material, practical cut, no decorative elements. They were physically varied in the way that a species sourcing crew from a planet of 9 billion tended to be varied, and they all had the particular ease of movement that came from long familiarity with microgravity environments. They were polite, efficient, and gave no indication that the presence of aliens in their docking bay was anything other than a routine matter. Isentar found that interesting too. Captain Okonkwo met them in a corridor just beyond the docking bay. She was taller than average for her species, Isentar noted. Her intelligence files had included height-range data, which she had read without expecting it to be relevant and now found herself automatically cross-referencing. Silver at the temples. Eyes the color of old wood, warm and extremely attentive. She extended a hand in the gesture that human culture used as a greeting of formal equality. The files had noted this, had explained its historical implications. The demonstration of an empty palm that came from an ancient need to show one was unarmed. And Isentar took it, pressing her smaller four-fingered hand against Okonkwo's, feeling the firm and steady grip. Subcommander Isentar, Okonkwo said, "Welcome to the Perseverance." Captain Okonkwo, Isentar met her eyes. The direct eye contact was a human social convention the files had noted. It indicated, in human cultural terms, sincerity and willingness to be seen. Isentar had practiced it in 11 previous first contacts and had never found it as naturally engaging as she found it now. "Thank you for the invitation." They looked at each other for exactly 1 second. The second contained something that neither of them commented on, an assessment, mutual and simultaneous. The two professionals on either side of the largest differential in recent human history looking at each other with the frank attention of people who understand that what comes next will be determined, in part, by what they see in this moment. Okonkwo's expression was open, direct, and entirely composed. It said, "I am exactly what I appear to be. Whether the same is true of you, I am about to find out." Isentar thought she has done this before in her mind many times. She has rehearsed this exact conversation. She knows what she wants from it. "Conference room is this way," Okonkwo said and turned and walked, and Isentar followed. The conference room was small and practical with a table that could seat 8 and currently seated 6, Okonkwo and 2 others on one side, Isentar and her 2 staff on the other. The table had a surface display embedded in it that was currently blank, and the walls had that particular quality of a space that was used functionally rather than designed for impression. No art, no ceremonial objects, just a room where people came to work through difficult things. Isentar looked at the 2 humans flanking Okonkwo. One was a lean, precise-looking individual with the bearing of a military officer in civilian clothing, introduced as Commander Adebjo. The other was a woman with the slightly distant attentiveness of someone recording everything, introduced as Liaison Petra Novik. Okonkwo poured water into glasses. Water, not any more complex beverage. The files had noted that water was universally neutral in human social contexts, a way of providing hospitality without implying anything about relative status. Another deliberate choice, Isentar noted. Everything was deliberate. "I imagine," Okonkwo said, settling back in her chair with the ease of someone in their own space, "that you have a number of questions." "Several," Isentar said, "though I'd like to begin with one." Okonkwo waited. "How long?" Isentar asked. "Not the ship specifically, the preparation. How long have you been preparing for this conversation?" Okonkwo looked at her for a moment. Not surprised, it was not, Isentar suspected, a question she hadn't anticipated, but something in the directness of it seemed to engage something in the human captain. A slight adjustment in her expression, not quite a smile, that suggested she respected the opening. 9 years, Okonkwo said, since we first detected your observation drones." The silence in the room had a specific shape to it. Isentar felt Chelenvas go very still beside her and knew that Prethsalen, on her other side, was doing the same thing, the disciplined stillness of trained professionals absorbing new information without expressing a reaction that their superior hadn't first expressed. "You detected them," Isentar said, not a question, a confirmation. "Not immediately, 3 years in, and we weren't certain at first. We had competing theories, but we proceeded on the assumption that we were being watched." Okonkwo's hands rested flat on the table, relaxed, open. It seemed the safer approach. And you said nothing, made no official response. No, if we were wrong, if it wasn't surveillance, if it was something else, then announcing that we detected it accomplished nothing. And if we were right, a pause. The slight expression that wasn't quite a smile returned. Then telling you we'd seen the drones would have told you exactly what we knew and prompted you to recalibrate your observation protocols. We preferred to let you keep watching. Isentar heard herself ask the next question before she'd fully decided to ask it. Why? Because, Okonkwo said, if you were watching, you were also learning. And what you were learning, what we were allowing you to learn, was a specific picture. She tilted her head slightly. Subcommander, I want to ask you something. In your intelligence files on our civilization, what was our largest recorded vessel? 12,000 tons, Isentar said. A commercial freighter called the Aurelius Bright. Yes, Okonkwo nodded slowly. We know about that categorization. We know approximately what your files say about us. We've had 9 years to think about what someone watching us from our outer system would see, and we've been careful about what was on the ecliptic to see. She paused. The Aurelius Bright is a real ship. She runs a real cargo route. Her crew are real people who have no idea any of this exists. A gesture brief and comprehensive that seemed to indicate everything outside the walls of the conference room, the perseverance, the corridor, the 17 contacts on Isentar's tactical feed. We weren't lying to you. We were simply showing you the parts of ourselves that we wanted you to see. Isentar thought about Karesh's report, about the words she hadn't read because nobody had flagged them as operationally relevant, about selective concealment followed by timely revelation. The ships, she said, where did you build them? Below the ecliptic, Okonkwo said it without drama. In a null pocket behind our fifth planet, your observation platforms were positioned to survey the ecliptic plane. Our fifth planet's magnetosphere creates significant sensor interference in the null pocket region even without deliberate countermeasures, which we also had. A beat. It took 31 years. 31 years? The number moved through Isentar's mind with the particular weight of something that rearranged adjacent facts as it passed. 31 years ago, the Conclave had been fighting the Marin insurgency. 31 years ago, humanity had been celebrating achievements in atmospheric flight, building their first orbital stations, taking their earliest clumsy steps into the solar system. And somewhere below the ecliptic, in the shadow of a gas giant, the decision had already been made. The program had already begun. Before the Conclave had even begun watching, humanity had started preparing for the possibility of being watched. You didn't know about us 31 years ago, Isentar said. No, Okonkwo agreed, but we knew that space was large and old and that we were neither. We knew that we had found no evidence of other civilizations, which was statistically unlikely given the size of the galaxy, which meant either we were genuinely alone or that others existed and we simply hadn't found them yet. The second possibility, she paused, considering her words. Humanity has a history, Subcommander. A long one by our own accounting, and not always a comfortable one to look at clearly. We know what happens when a civilization with more capability encounters one with less, and decides that the less capable one would be better off integrated into something larger. A pause that was not a silence but a considered stop. We decided we would rather be introduced to the galaxy from a position of something other than helplessness. On the resolute patience, Isentar's bridge crew maintained their stations with the focused professionalism of people who understood that their subcommander was currently across 40,000 kilometers of vacuum, having a conversation that none of them could hear. While 17 contacts that shouldn't exist maintained positions around their convoy, with the patient immobility of very large objects that had decided exactly where they wanted to be. The communications officer was monitoring all frequencies. The sensor team was running continuous analysis on the contacts, building a picture that grew more detailed and more alarming in equal proportion as the sweeps accumulated data. The weapons officer had the convoy systems at readiness that was a step below active, ready to step forward but not yet stepped, following protocol, following training. Following the unspoken understanding, shared by everyone on the bridge without anyone needing to say it aloud, that the 17 contacts surrounding them had already made any consideration of their convoy's weapon readiness somewhat academic. The largest contact, the one that had rotated, had not changed aspect. It sat in the middle of Prethsalen's deputy's sensor display, presenting its full profile, and the full profile was 31 years of quiet, patient, carefully concealed engineering expressing itself in steel and drive plasma, and the unmistakable geometry of a ship that had been designed to fight and had been designed to win. The deputy sensor officer, a young Veth named Tessalon who had joined the fleet 6 years ago from the mapping corps, and who had the precise empirical turn of mind that sensor work demanded, had been running the numbers on the contact's weapon emplacements for the past 40 minutes. Not because she had been ordered to, because the numbers were there and her mind was the kind that couldn't leave numbers unfinished. She finished them now. She looked at what she had. She looked at it for a moment with the expression of someone who has produced a calculation whose result they do not especially want to report. Then she flagged the analysis quietly for the convoy's senior officer in Isentar's absence, wrote the summary note with the careful objectivity of her training, and sat back in her chair and looked at the contact on her display and thought about the civilization that had built it, and about the 9 years they had spent watching and waiting and said nothing, and about the 31 years before that spent building what was now presenting its profile in the Kepler corridor, with the unhurried composure of something that knew exactly what it was. The note she'd written said, in the stripped-down language of sensor analysis, estimated combat capability of the largest contact, designation pending, assessed at approximately 2.4 times equivalent of convoy flagship. Estimate preliminary and likely conservative given incomplete data. Recommend full assessment pending full sensor access. What it didn't say, because sensor analysis notes didn't include this kind of observation, was the thing Tessalon was actually thinking as she looked at the display. Which was, they let us watch for 11 years. They flew their freighters right where we could see them. They launched their fireworks. And the whole time this was behind the planet. She thought about what that required. Not the engineering was remarkable, but engineering was a solved problem if you had enough time and enough will. What she thought about was the discipline of it. The sustained, collective, cross-generational discipline of an entire civilization maintaining a secret not for a year or a decade but for 31 years, across changes of government and changes of priority, and the 1,000 disruptions that history imposed on every long project. The discipline of letting yourself be observed, and showing exactly what you wanted to be seen, and not showing what you didn't, and maintaining that discipline for long enough that the observers became confident. She thought, they are not what we thought they were. And then, almost immediately, a second thought that she would not write in any report, but that sat in her chest with the weight of something important. They never were. We just didn't look at the right places. Back in the conference room, Isentar was asking the question she had been building toward for 40 minutes, not hurrying to it because it required the context she had been accumulating, and because she had the sense that Okonkwo would respect the approach more than the shortcut. The ships, she said, what are they for? Okonkwo looked at her steadily. What do you mean? I mean, Isentar paused, choosing precision. I mean their purpose, not their function. Their function is clear, their purpose. You've built 17 combat vessels that your own civilization had no public knowledge of, maintained them in secrecy for what you tell me is 31 years, and deployed them today at the first moment of contact with an outside civilization. I want to understand what you intend. We don't intend anything, Okonkwo said. That's the point. Isentar waited. They're not an invasion fleet, Okonkwo continued. We have no interest in expanding at anyone's expense. We're not planning a campaign. We're not looking for territory. She seemed to consider how to say the next thing. Subcommander, do you know what the word deterrence means? In our language, it comes from a Latin root. It means to frighten away from. She paused. We're not here because we want to fight. We're here because we want you to understand that a fight would be a specific kind of experience, and that understanding should change what you're willing to propose. The room was quiet. Outside the Perseverance's hull, the corridor held its cold silence, and the 17 ships held their positions, and in the tactical display on the Resolute Patience, the largest contact continued to present its profile, not threatening, not advancing, simply visible. Simply undeniably, irrevocably there. Terms of integration, Isentar said slowly. The phrase had a different weight than it had carried 90 minutes ago. That's what I was sent here to offer. I know, Okonkwo said, and I want to be fair to you. We know you're not the decision maker. We know you're the instrument of a policy that was decided by people who are currently a very long way from here. A slight pause. We're not angry about this. We know how empires work. We studied yours quite carefully. Another pause, shorter. We've studied all of the ones in our own history too. And, Isentar said, and we would like a different kind of conversation than the one you were sent to have. Okonkwo leaned forward slightly, and there was something in the movement, a shifting of weight that Isentar's long experience of reading bodies across species recognized as the arrival of a central point. Not a conversation about terms, a conversation between civilizations that are meeting for the first time as equals, because that, a pause that was timed precisely, is what we are. Isentar looked at her. She looked at Commander Adebio, whose military bearing had not shifted in 40 minutes and whose eyes had the focused patience of someone standing guard in a way that required no movement. She looked at Liaison Novik, whose quiet record-keeping had been so unobtrusive that Isentar had almost forgotten she was there, and who looked back with a calm that matched her captain's. She thought about the dossier, about 12,000 tons and no warships, about fireworks, about Drunsatha's dismissive claw and the comfortable laughter of a council chamber and the empty space on the wall where the 115th seal was supposed to go. She thought about 31 years. She thought about the particular quality of Okonkwo's voice from the very first transmission, the complete absence of scale shock, the composure that lived on the other side of preparation, and she understood it now in a way she hadn't then. Okonkwo wasn't calm because she was trained to appear calm. She was calm because she was standing exactly where she had been intending to stand, had been preparing to stand, had spent years constructing the specific circumstances that would allow her to stand here, in this room, at this table, and say these words in this order to exactly this kind of visitor. You planned this, Isentar said. It was not an accusation, it was recognition. We planned for the possibility of this, Okonkwo said. There's a difference. A pause. We hoped we'd never need it. But you built it anyway. Oh yes. Well, because, Okonkwo said quietly, hope is not a strategy. And we had read enough of both our own history and what we could learn of yours to know that arriving at this conversation without options was not something we were willing to do. Isentar sat with that for a moment, felt the full weight of it, the full weight of 11 years of observation that had seen exactly what it was supposed to see, of 17 ships emerging from fold space in 4 seconds, of a human captain who had answered an Empire's first transmission with the steady, unhurried confidence of someone who had been expecting the call. She thought about the message she was going to have to send to the Eternal Mandate, about the words she was going to have to find for Fleet Marshal Drun Sotha, who had waved a claw at humanity's solar system and said we remind them what a real fleet looks like. She thought about his face when she told him what a real fleet looked like. Captain Okonkwo, she said at last, and her voice had changed, had shifted into something that was no longer the measured instrument of an absorption protocol, but simply the voice of someone working through a genuine recalibration. I need to contact my command. Of course, Okonkwo said, take whatever time you need. She stood and Adebio and Novik stood with her, and she looked at Isentar with the direct, warm, attentive eyes of a woman who had spent 9 years preparing for this conversation and was finding it, if the slight easing around her eyes was any indication, something close to what she had hoped it would be. We'll wait. A pause. The order to retreat did not come as a shout. It came as silence. A suffocating, creeping silence that spread across the bridge of Admiral Vale Torren's flagship like a living thing. The kind of silence that only existed when reality refused to align with belief, when certainty cracked, and something darker began to seep through. The Galactic Empire did not retreat. It advanced, it conquered, it erased. It did not run. And yet, the stars outside the viewport told a different story. Status report, Torren said, his voice controlled but thinner than before. No one answered immediately. Not because they didn't hear him, but because they didn't know what to say. The tactical display hovered above the command pit, flickering erratically as it struggled to process the chaos unfolding in real time. Imperial ships, once arranged in perfect formation, were now scattered, broken apart like shattered glass drifting in the void. And everywhere there were humans. Not in neat lines. Not in predictable patterns. But surrounding them, closing in, adapting with every passing second. Admiral, the tactical officer, finally spoke, his voice strained. We've lost contact with 9 more cruisers. Destroyer Wing 3 is gone. Gone, Torren repeated. No debris field, no escape signatures, they just, the officer swallowed. They ceased to exist. Torren's gaze shifted slowly back to the viewport. Space itself seemed wrong. Distorted. As if something massive was bending the laws of reality at the edges of perception. Then he saw it. The ringed ship. It moved with terrifying calm, its massive rotating structures humming with an energy that made sensors scream in protest. It did not rush. It did not evade. It simply advanced. Like a predator that already knew the outcome of the hunt. What is that thing? Someone whispered. No one answered. Because there was no answer. A sharp alarm cut through the bridge. FTL drives failing, the navigation officer shouted. We're being locked out, something is jamming jump coordinates. Torren stepped forward, override it. We've tried, Admiral, the field is layered. It's not a single disruption, it's dozens overlapping. They're adjusting in real time. Impossible, Torren snapped. But even as he said it, he knew. That word no longer meant anything here. Range to system edge. At current speeds, the navigator hesitated. We won't make it. The implication hung in the air. They were trapped, not by brute force, but by design. Torren's mind raced, grasping for structure, for logic. The Empire's doctrine had always been clear: control the battlefield, dictate the engagement, overwhelm with superior precision. But the humans, they had never followed those rules. They planned this, Torrens said quietly. The realization struck harder than any weapon. This wasn't a defense. It wasn't even a battle. It was an ambush. Incoming transmission, communications reported. Torrens' head snapped toward the console. Source. The ringed vessel. Of course it was. He hesitated for only a fraction of a second. Put it through. The bridge dimmed slightly as the transmission overrode standard displays. There was no visual feed, only audio. And then a voice. Calm. Steady. Humans. You thought we were behind, it said. You thought we were weak. Each word landed with deliberate weight. You were wrong. Torren felt something cold settle in his chest. Open a return channel, he ordered. A soft tone confirmed the connection. This is Admiral Vale Torren of the Galactic Empire, he said, forcing strength into his voice. You have engaged Imperial forces without provocation. Cease hostilities immediately and we may yet. A faint sound interrupted him. Laughter. Not loud. Not mockings. Just certain. Without provocation, the human voice replied, you crossed into our system with a fleet. A pause. We call that provocations. Torren's jaw tightened. You misunderstand, this was a reconnaissance. No, the voice cut in, still calm. We understand perfectly. The line went quiet for a moment. Then, we've been watching you for a long time, Admiral. Torren's breath caught. Watching? How long? He demanded. Another pause. Longer this time. Long enough. The transmission cut. And the battle resumed with renewed intensity. Admiral, the tactical officer shouted. Multiple new contacts bearing 037 mark. The display flared. New signals flooded the system. At first, Torren thought it was an error. Then the numbers stabilized. That's not possible, someone whispered. Dozens of ships. Then hundreds. Human ships. They weren't jumping in. They were appearing. As if they had been there all along, hidden beyond detection, masked by whatever impossible technology the humans now wielded. We're surrounded, the navigator said, his voice hollow. For the first time in his career, Admiral Vale Torren had no immediate command to give. No maneuver to execute. No tactic to deploy. Because there was no formation left to save. Shields at 30%. Port side collapsing. Boarding impact on Deck 7. The bridge erupted into controlled chaos. Torren moved through it like a ghost, issuing orders that felt increasingly meaningless. Redirect power to forward shields. Target the nearest cluster, fire at will. Maintain. A violent tremor shook the ship. Lights flickered. Direct hit, someone yelled. Armor breach sections 12 through 14. Torren grabbed onto the command rail, steadying himself as the deck lurched beneath his feet. Outside, he saw it happen. An Imperial battleship, one of their strongest, attempted to break through the encirclement. Its engines flared, pushing beyond safe limits as it charged toward open space. It almost made it. Then a human ship intercepted. Smaller, cruder. It didn't fire. It rammed. The impact was catastrophic. For both vessels. But as the explosion blossomed into a blinding sphere of light, Torren realized something horrifying. The human ship had chosen that. Calculated it. Accepted it. They're using suicide tactics, an officer whispered. No, Torren said slowly. His eyes remained fixed on the expanding debris field. They're using winning tactics. Another alarms. Closer this time. Boarders on the bridge levels. That snapped the room into focus. Security teams hold them, Torren barked. But even as the order left his lips, the doors at the far end of the bridge shuddered. Once, twice, then exploded inward. Smoke and sparks filled the air as armored figures burst through the breach. Humans. Their armor was scarred, dented, functional. Their weapons were already firing. Kinetic rounds tore through the air, shattering consoles, punching through bodies, ripping apart the illusion of safety that the bridge had once held. Imperial guards returned fire, but it was chaos now. Close quarters, unpredictable movement. The humans didn't hesitate. They advanced. Relentless. One fell. Another took their place. They don't stop, someone screamed. Torin stood frozen for a fraction of a second, watching it unfold. This wasn't warfare as the Empire understood it. This was something else. Something raw. Something terrifying. "Admiral, we have to go," the navigator shouted. "An escape route. A final option." Torin hesitated. His empire, his fleet, was collapsing around him. But survival. Survival was still possible. For him. For now. Another explosion rocked the bridge. Closer. Too close. Torin made his decision. "Signal full retreat," he said quietly. Even as he spoke the words, he knew. It was already too late. As he was escorted toward the emergency exit, Torin cast one final glance at the viewport. The human fleet had closed completely. Their chaotic formation had become something else entirely. Net, tightening, unbreakable, and in the center of it all, the ringed ship. Watching, waiting, dominating. Torin felt it then. Not just fear, but understanding. Humanity had not been behind. They had not been weak. They had been patient, silent, observing every move the Empire made, learning its patterns, its arrogance, its assumptions. And when the moment came, they had struck with everything they had. Ships no one believed they possessed. Tactics no one could predict. A will no one could break. As the last escape pod launched into the void, carrying the remnants of Admiral Vale Torin's command, the battlefield behind him burned. And across the galaxy, the message began to spread. Not as a rumor, not as speculation, but as a warning. A truth carved into the fabric of every known system. Never underestimate humans.